Look down at your hands right now. In your pocket or in your palm, you are holding a slab of tempered glass and refined silicon. Inside it, microscopic electrical charges race through billions of transistors at the speed of light. It connects you to satellites orbiting thousands of miles above the planet's atmosphere. It allows you to speak instantly to someone sitting in a cafe in Tokyo, or on a farm in Argentina, or in a flat in London. We call this the modern world. We call it globalization. We treat it as if it were natural, as if the human animal was always destined to be tethered together in an invisible, planetary web of instantaneous communication. We take it for granted. We look at a map of international shipping lanes, undersea fiber optic cables, and flight corridors, and we assume that connection is the default state of humanity. It is not. For 99% of the time our species has walked this earth, the default state of human existence was not connection. It was terrifying, absolute, suffocating isolation. Imagine taking a time machine back 12,000 years. The last great glaciers of the Ice Age are retreating, grinding their way back toward the poles, leaving behind a scarred, barren landscape of tundra, swamp, and primordial forest. You are an anatomically modern human. Your brain is identical to the brain you have today. You feel love, fear, jealousy, greed, curiosity, and grief in the exact same biological ways. But your universe, your entire known reality, is bounded by the ridge of mountains you can see on the horizon on a clear morning. That mountain range, perhaps 20 or 30 miles away, is the edge of the world. Beyond that ridge lies the unknown. Beyond that ridge lies death. Your society is not a nation, or a city, or even a village. Your society is 30 to 50 people. People you have known since the moment you were pushed screaming into the dirt. You know the sound of every person's cough in the middle of the night. You know the gait of your brother's walk from half a mile away across the plain. You share every calorie of mammoth fat, deer meat, and wild berry. You survive because the band survives. If you are separated from the band, you die within days from exposure, predators, or starvation. And what happens when you climb that ridge? What happens when, while hunting a wounded aurochs, you look down into the adjacent valley, and you see smoke rising from a copse of birch trees? Smoke that does not belong to your band's fire? Every biological alarm bell in your nervous system begins to scream. To ancient humans, strangers were not potential friends. Strangers were not business partners. Strangers were apex predators competing for the exact same finite calories that kept your children from starving to death. A foreign band of humans meant danger. It meant violence. It meant abducted women, stolen meat, and territory lost. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer context scenarios describe the encounter as a state of hypervigilance, spears gripped until knuckles turn white, adrenaline flooding the bloodstream, every muscle coiled either to sprint or to kill. The baseline of human interaction for hundreds of millennia was xenophobia in its purest, most evolutionary sense, fear of the outsider. In that primeval silence, every sound carried the weight of survival. The snap of a frozen twig underfoot, the distant warning call of a black grouse, the sudden silence of songbirds when a lynx passed beneath the canopy. To step outside the perimeter of your clan's firelight was to enter a sensory reality where every shadow concealed an apex predator, and every unknown ridge marked the boundary of life and death. The human mind had to remain perpetually coiled, analyzing every rustle of the leaves and every shift in the wind to protect the fragile flame of human life from the encroaching darkness. Consider the landscape of the Upper Paleolithic and Early Mesolithic. There were no borders drawn on maps, because there were no maps. There were no legal codes, because there was no state apparatus to enforce them. If a dispute arose between two bands over a grove of nut trees, or a watering hole frequented by migrating red deer, there was no court of arbitration. There was only the spear, the heavy wooden club, and the sling stone. Archaeological digs across Europe and Western Asia from this epoch bear silent, grim testimony to this reality. Skulls recovered from late Pleistocene burials frequently exhibit unhealed cranial fractures, depressed fractures caused by blunt force trauma from behind. Skeletons are found with flint projectile points embedded deeply in pelvic bones and spinal vertebrae. Human cannibalism, while debated in its frequency, appears in the archaeological record not always as ritual veneration, but as resource predation during catastrophic winter freezes. In this world of razor-sharp evolutionary pressure, why would anyone take a single step toward an unknown human being? What could possibly be powerful enough to overcome that primal terror? What could force a human being to put down their spear, step out from behind the tree line, and walk into the camp of a stranger with their hands held open? It was not diplomacy. It was not a sudden realization of universal brotherhood. It was not philosophy. It was a shiny, razor-sharp piece of black volcanic glass called obsidian. You are listening to The Grand Narrative. I am your host, and this is Season 1, The First Networks. In this season, we are dismantling the myth that globalization is a modern invention. We are going to prove that long before the invention of the wheel, long before the rise of the pharaohs, long before money, writing, or mathematics, human beings were already building complex, intercontinental networks across thousands of miles of wilderness. Today, in Episode 1, we journey back to the Deep Stone Age to walk the forgotten trails of the world's first supermaterial. This is the story of how an obsession with volcanic glass cracked open our isolated world and set humanity on an irreversible course towards civilization. Let us set the stage properly. When we think of the Stone Age, the Upper Paleolithic transitioning into the Neolithic, we tend to picture crude cavemen smashing dull gray rocks together. We imagine a life that the philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously described as nasty, brutish, and short. And in many ways, Hobbes was right. The environment was relentlessly hostile. If you broke your leg on a hunt, you were dead. If an infection set into your tooth, you suffered agonizing pain until sepsis took you. If the winter lasted 2 weeks longer than usual, your elders and infants starved. Imagine the sensory reality of a winter hunt 12,000 years ago during the Younger Dryas. A sudden, brutal 1,000-year cold snap that plunged the northern hemisphere back into near-glacial conditions. You are tracking a herd of red deer across a frozen peat bog in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. The wind is howling out of the northeast, driving sharp needles of frozen sleet into your eyes. Your boots are made of stitched reindeer hide stuffed with dry sphagnum moss for insulation. Your body burns 5,000 calories a day just to maintain core body temperature. If you return to the cave empty-handed tonight, your 3-year-old daughter will go to sleep crying from hunger, chewing on a scrap of dried rawhide to fool her stomach. You spot the lead stag standing among a cluster of frozen dwarf birches 80 yards away. You drop to your knees in the freezing slush. You reach into your hide quiver and draw an ashwood arrow. Tied to the tip of that shaft with wet sinew and sealed with pine pitch is a bifacially flaked obsidian projectile point, barely 2 inches long. The point is so sharp that its serrated edges catch the cold winter light like polished black ice. You notch the arrow to your sinew-back bow. You draw the string back to your cheek, feeling 60 pounds of tension straining in the wood. You release. The arrow flies through the freezing air with a soft hum. Because the obsidian point is so infinitesimally thin and frictionless, it does not bounce off the animal's thick winter coat. It slices through the hide, passes between 2 ribs without glancing, and penetrates deep into the heart and lungs of the stag. The animal leaps once, runs 20 yards, and collapses in the snow. In that single moment, between the flight of an arrow and the death of a stag, the difference between the survival of your family and the extinction of your lineage rested entirely on the microscopic molecular sharpness of that single piece of volcanic glass. In that brutal calculus of survival, efficiency was everything. The difference between life and death came down to your tools. Think about what a tool meant to a Paleolithic human. You have no metal. Iron is sleeping undisturbed in the Earth's crust, thousands of years away from being smelted. Bronze does not exist. Copper has not been discovered. Everything you use to manipulate physical reality must be carved from wood, bone, antler, or stone. If you kill an elk, you have to skin that animal before the carcass rots or before hyenas and cave lions scent the blood. You have to scrape the flesh from the hide so you can turn it into clothing to survive sub-zero temperatures. You have to butcher 50 pounds of meat and slice it into strips to dry over smoke. You have to carve bone needles to sew that hide. You have to fashion sharp projectile points to tip your throwing spears for the next hunt. Try doing any of that with a piece of ordinary limestone or granite. It is agonizingly slow. Granite does not hold an edge. It crumbles. Limestone blunts after 3 cuts. Flint, chert, is better. Flint can be knapped into sharp flakes. For hundreds of thousands of years, flint was the workhorse of humanity. But flint was the equivalent of iron. Obsidian was titanium. When you hold a freshly knapped blade of high-grade obsidian in your hand, you are holding something that defies the natural coarseness of the Stone Age world. It is pitch black, glassy, and smooth as ice. When held up to the light, its thinnest edges are translucent, glowing with a smoky, amber hue. And when an expert stone knapper strikes an obsidian core with an antler billet, it does not shatter unpredictably. Because obsidian has no crystalline structure, it is an amorphous, supercooled liquid. It fractures along conchoidal planes with mathematical perfection. It shears away in long, razor-thin blades called prismatic blades. How sharp is an obsidian edge? This is not hyperbole. A freshly fractured obsidian blade is roughly 500 times sharper than the sharpest surgical steel scalpel manufactured today. The cutting edge of a modern stainless steel razor blade is around 300 to 500 angstroms thick. The cutting edge of an obsidian blade can reach a thickness of just 30 angstroms, literally a single molecule of silicon dioxide. When a modern surgeon cuts through human flesh with a steel scalpel under an electron microscope, the steel actually tears and crushes the cells on either side of the incision. When you cut with an obsidian blade, the edge is so infinitesimally thin that it passes between the individual cells without tearing their membranes. Incisions made with obsidian heal with dramatically less scarring and faster tissue regeneration. 12,000 years ago, to a hunter-gatherer living in a world of blunt wood and dull stone, an obsidian blade was nothing short of miraculous technology. With an obsidian scraper, you could process a deer hide in 1/4 of the time. With an obsidian blade, you could carve bone with surgical precision. With an obsidian point lashed to the tip of a spear, your weapon penetrated 3 inches deeper into the chest cavity of a charging wild boar, puncturing the lungs and dropping the animal instantly instead of leaving it to run 10 miles across the savannah while you chased its blood trail. Obsidian meant more food. It meant warmer clothes. It meant fewer dead hunters. It meant survival. There was only one catastrophic problem. To appreciate the technological supremacy of obsidian, one must understand the physics of the conchoidal fracture. When an external mechanical force is applied to a homogeneous, non-crystalline substance like obsidian, the kinetic energy does not follow internal crystalline cleavage planes. Instead, the shockwave radiates outward through the silica matrix in smooth, concentric curved ripples, identical to the ripples formed when a pebble is dropped into a still pond of water. A master Neolithic stone knapper understood this physics instinctively through muscle memory. By controlling 3 precise mechanical variables. First, the angle of the strike. Second, the point of impact on the prepared striking platform. Third, the density and hardness of the percussor. The knapper could predict with millimeter accuracy where the fracture plane would propagate through the stone. From a single 5-pound polyhedral core of Cappadocian obsidian, an expert knapper could produce over 100 continuous meters of razor-sharp cutting edge. In contrast, working with low-grade nodular chert or tabular limestone produced less than 5 meters of usable edge per 5 pounds of raw stone, with over 80% of the material lost as shattered, unusable waste debitage. In the brutal economic calculus of the late Pleistocene, where every calorie expended on tool manufacture had to be balanced against calories gained from butchered game, an obsidian core represented a technological efficiency multiplier of 2,000%. Volcanoes do not erupt everywhere. To understand the birth of the first trade routes, you have to understand the violent geology of the earth. Obsidian is not an ordinary rock that you can dig out of a riverbed or quarry from a common hillside. It is born from catastrophe. It is formed only during highly specific, rare volcanic events involving felsic lava, lava that is exceptionally rich in silica, potassium, and sodium, with a silica content exceeding 70%. When a volcano erupts with this specific chemical composition, if the lava cools slowly beneath the earth or within a thick flow, the minerals have time to nucleate and crystallize into coarse granite or fine-grained rhyolite. But if that silica-rich lava is suddenly extruded onto the surface and cools almost instantaneously, quenched by violent contact with glacial meltwater, cold ocean swells, or freezing alpine air, there is zero time for a crystalline lattice to organize. The molten rock freezes in place in a disordered, amorphous, glassy state. It is, quite literally, volcanic glass forged in the fires of the Earth's mantle. Because of this extreme geological recipe, obsidian deposits on the planet are rare, isolated, and geographically concentrated in violent tectonic collision zones. In the entire expanse of Western Asia and the Mediterranean basin, an area covering millions of square miles, there were only a handful of major volcanic complexes that produced high-quality, workable tool-grade obsidian. First, the volcanic fields of central Anatolia, specifically the twin volcanic peaks of Gala Dag and Ninazi Dag in the volcanic province of Cappadocia, and the colossal stratovolcano of Mount Hassan, which rises over 10,000 feet above the Konya plain. Second, the massive volcanic caldera of Nimrod Dag, towering over the western shore of Lake Van in eastern Anatolia, and the nearby Bengal volcanic fields. Third, the isolated volcanic island of Melos in the Aegean Sea, flanked by the smaller island of Antiparos. And fourth, scattered island sources in the central and western Mediterranean, the Aeolian island of Lipari off the northern coast of Sicily, the island of Pantelleria in the Sicilian Channel, Palmarola in the Pontine Islands, and the volcanic massif of Monte Arsi on the western coast of Sardinia. Think about the psychological and geopolitical reality of that geographic inequality. The Earth did not distribute its technological wealth fairly. Nature created hyperdense pockets of technological supremacy surrounded by thousands of miles of resource poverty. If you were fortunate enough to be born in the shadow of Mount Hassan or Gala Dag in central Anatolia, you were living on top of an infinite mountain of black gold. You could walk out of your brush shelter, walk 50 paces up a dry gully, and pick up football-sized nodules of jet-black volcanic glass that could be split into thousands of razor-sharp blades. You were rich in the only currency that mattered in the Stone Age, cutting technology. You could knap blades with zero anxiety about breaking them, because the entire mountain behind your camp was composed of glass. You could experiment. You could innovate. Anatolian knappers developed techniques to produce elongated, ribbon-like pressure blades that were 20 centimeters long, masterpieces of lithic craftsmanship that were as delicate as autumn leaves and sharper than diamond. You had mirrors. Archaeologists excavating early Anatolian settlements found circular plates of obsidian that had been rubbed with water and fine volcanic ash until the surface was so perfectly reflective that you could see the pores on your face and the individual hairs of your eyebrows. In a world where no human had ever seen their own face except in the rippling, distorted surface of a muddy puddle, an obsidian mirror was an artifact of profound spiritual and psychological power. To gaze into an obsidian mirror was to look into the spirit world. It was to meet your own soul. Archaeological excavations of the female burials at Catalhook by Ian Hodder revealed that obsidian mirrors were not treated as mere vanity items. They were deeply sacred ritual artifacts placed directly over the hearts of elite deceased women and shamans. The back of each mirror was embedded in a thick, molded casing of lime plaster painted with red ochre pigment, while the reflective glass face pointed upward toward the spirit realm. Microscopic where analysis of the mirror surfaces revealed tiny circular micro-scratches caused by repeated polishing with soft leather soaked in sacred scented oils and river water over decades. To the Neolithic mind, an obsidian mirror was a portal between dimensions, a dark, crystalline lens that allowed shamans to gaze into the cosmic underworld, commune with ancestral spirits, and interpret the dreams that guided the seasonal movements of the clan. But what if you didn't live in Cappadocia? What if you were a band of Natufian hunter-gatherers living 400 miles to the south, in the lush, oak-forested valleys of the Levant, modern-day Israel, Jordan, Palestine, and Lebanon. You had wild emmer wheat. You had herds of gazelle roaming the hillsides. You had freshwater springs. But your bedrock was limestone, chalk, and dolomite. You had flint, yes, but your flint was brittle, full of inclusions, and prone to snapping when struck. You had no obsidian. Not a single pebble. For generations, your ancestors survived without it. But then, one day, a neighboring band walks into your valley, and around the neck of their headman hangs a pendant made of a stone you have never seen before. A stone as dark as the midnight sky, polished until you can see your own reflection in its surface. And lashed to the tip of his hunting spear is a translucent, serrated black point that cuts through flesh like water. You look at your own dull flint tools. You look at that black glass. The human brain does something that no other animal brain can do. It assigns abstract, disproportionate value to rarity. The moment a human realizes that an object exists which is vastly superior to what they currently possess, and that this object cannot be found anywhere in their native landscape, that object ceases to be mere stone. It becomes a talisman of power, prestige, and survival. It becomes a commodity. Now, let us examine the sheer physical reality of what it meant to bridge the gap in 9000 BCE. Today, if a company in London wants to import marble from Italy, a cargo ship carries thousands of tons across the Mediterranean in 4 days. If a manufacturing plant in Detroit needs microchips from Taiwan, a Boeing 747 flies them across the Pacific Ocean in 14 hours. In 9000 BC, there are no ships. There are no planes. There are no carts, because the wheel will not be invented for another 5,000 years. There are no pack animals. The horse is still a wild, untamed beast hunted for its meat on the Eurasian steppes. The donkey has not been domesticated in northeast Africa. The camel is an obscure wild creature in the Arabian deserts. The only machine that exists on the surface of the planet Earth is the human body. The only engine is human muscle. The only suspension system is the human arch and the human spine. The only cargo container is a leather pouch or a woven reed basket slung over the shoulders, with a tumpline strapped across the forehead. To move an object from Cappadocia to the Jordan Valley required a human being to lift that weight onto their back and physically carry it, step by step, over 450 miles of unmapped, roadless, predatory wilderness. Let us map that journey in our minds. You leave the volcanic slopes of Galadag, where you have spent 2 weeks napping raw obsidian boulders down into transportable, polyhedral cores, cylindrical blocks of glass about the size of a human forearm, weighing 5 to 8 pounds each, from which dozens of razor blades can be struck later on demand. You pack 6 of these cores into your hide backpack. That is 40 pounds of dead, unyielding stone digging into your shoulders. You head south. Immediately, you are confronted by one of the most formidable natural barriers in the ancient world, the Taurus Mountains. The Taurus Range is a wall of jagged limestone peaks rising over 10,000 feet into the sky. Let us reconstruct the day-to-day survival mechanics of an ancient trekking party traversing the Taurus Range in 9000 BC. The expedition could only be attempted during a narrow 4-month window between late spring, after the mountain snows had melted from the passes, and early autumn, before the first winter blizzard sealed the high gorges. The travelers moved in small, disciplined cohorts of 4 to 6 individuals, typically seasoned young hunters bound by kinship and proven endurance. Each traveler carried a specialized survival kit, a hide backpack supported by a woven bark fiber tumpline worn across the forehead to distribute the crushing downward weight across the cervical spine, a skin canteen filled with fresh water or crushed berry juice, a leather pouch containing high-calorie trail rations, dried strips of venison and ibex meat, pounded wild pistachios, roasted acorns, and dried wild figs. A tinder kit consisting of iron pyrite nodules, dry tinder fungus, and flint strikolites carried in a waterproof bladder to ensure fire could be kindled in driving rain. And primary defensive weaponry: a straight-grained ash spear tipped with a bone point, a polished greenstone hand axe for chopping firewood, and a rawhide sling with selected river pebbles. Every river crossing was an existential crisis. The rivers of the Taurus, fed by roaring glacial meltwater, raged through narrow, limestone-walled canyons with crushing hydraulic force. To cross, the men had to link arms in a triangular formation, wedging their feet between slippery river boulders, moving one step at a time while the freezing current reached their chests. A single lost footing meant being swept downstream against jagged limestone rocks. When night fell, the party sought natural rock shelters or shallow caves perched high above the valley floors. They built 2 parallel campfires across the cave mouth, creating a corridor of heat and smoke that deterred prowling cave hyenas and brown bears, while masking their scent from hostile human bands patrolling the surrounding ridges. There are no paved mountain passes. There are no bridges over the roaring, glacial torrents of the Goksu and Seihan rivers. You must pick your way through treacherous limestone scree, where a single slip means a shattered ankle and a slow death. You must navigate through the Cilician Gates, a narrow, claustrophobic gorge where vertical cliffs tower hundreds of feet above you, and where flash floods can sweep through without warning. And the mountains are not empty. In the Neolithic, the forests of the Taurus Mountains were home to brown bears weighing 800 pounds, packs of gray wolves, leopards, and European lions. Furthermore, you are trespassing. Every valley you cross is the hunting territory of a different band of indigenous hunter-gatherers who do not speak your dialect, who do not know your ancestors, and who view any armed stranger carrying a valuable load of stone as either an invader to be killed or a target to be plundered. If you are traveling as a direct trader, this journey, 450 miles one way, takes at least 6 to 8 weeks of brutal, continuous physical exertion. You must forage for every meal along the way. You must find fresh water every afternoon. You must sleep with one eye open, shivering beneath a deer hide while the fire burns down to embers, clutching your stone axe in the dark. And yet, when archaeologists excavate Natufian and pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the Levant, sites like Jericho, Ain Ghazal, Beta, and Nahal Hemer, do you know what they find buried in the deepest, oldest stratigraphic layers of the earth? Obsidian. Hundreds of miles away from the nearest volcano, sitting in the dust of ancient hearths, live flakes, blades, and cores of Cappadocian and Bengal obsidian. How did it get there? Did heroic, solitary Stone Age traders really walk 500 miles across the Taurus Mountains and back again every summer? The answer uncovered by modern archaeological science is far more fascinating than a single man walking across a continent. The answer reveals the emergence of the world's first complex, decentralized economic network. In the late 1960s, and 1970s, two British archaeologists, Colin Renfrew and J.E. Dixon, pioneered a revolutionary scientific technique that changed our understanding of ancient history forever: optical emission spectroscopy and X-ray fluorescence analysis applied to obsidian. You see, obsidian has a unique superpower that makes it an archaeologist's dream material. Because every volcanic eruption has a distinct chemical fingerprint, a precise, unrepeatable mixture of trace elements like rubidium, strontium, zirconium, yttrium, niobium, and barium, an archaeologist can pick up an obsidian arrowhead found in the dirt of an ancient village in Syria, shoot an X-ray beam through it, and determine the exact, specific volcanic slope in Turkey or Armenia where that stone was quarried 10,000 years ago. It is an immutable geological passport. When Renfrew and his colleagues began mapping the chemical signatures of thousands of obsidian artifacts found across the Middle East, they noticed a stunning mathematical pattern. If direct traders were walking straight from the Cappadocian volcanoes to distant sites like Jericho, you would expect the quantity of obsidian to remain relatively constant or drop off randomly depending on which specific settlements the trader liked to visit. Instead, they found a near-perfect mathematical curve, an exponential decay curve. Within a radius of about 150 to 200 miles from the volcanic source, a region archaeologists call the supply zone, obsidian was everywhere. In Neolithic villages in central Anatolia, obsidian accounted for 80 to 90% of all the chipped stone tools found in the excavations. People used it casually. They threw away broken blades. They treated it like a common household utility. But as you move past that 200-mile mark into the contact zone, the percentage of obsidian dropped dramatically. At 300 miles away, obsidian made up only 5% of the stone tools. At 400 miles away, it was less than 1%. At 500 miles away, in the southernmost reaches of the Levant, obsidian artifacts were vanishingly rare, often found only as tiny, meticulously reworked blades, delicate amulets, or prestige grave goods buried with elite individuals. Renfrew realized he was looking at the mathematical footprint of a specific economic mechanism. Down the line, trade. Let us break down how. Down the line, trade actually functioned on the ground, because it is one of the most brilliant emergent behaviors in human history. Imagine a chain of 20 different Neolithic communities stretching from the volcanic highlands of Turkey all the way down to the Dead Sea. Let us call them Community 1 at the volcano, Community 2 30 miles south, Community 3 60 miles south, and so on, all the way to Community 20 in the south. Community 1 quarries a massive haul of obsidian from the slopes of Galadag. They keep 80% of it for their own daily use. But they have a surplus, say 50 raw cores. They do not hike 500 miles south. They walk 30 miles south to the territory of Community 2. Community 2 lives in a fertile valley where wild sheep are abundant. They have an excess of finely tanned sheepskins and dried mutton. Community 1 and Community 2 meet at a traditional borderland, a neutral clearing near a river. They engage in a reciprocal gift exchange. Community 1 hands over 50 obsidian cores. Community 2 hands over 30 tanned sheepskins and a mountain of dried meat. Both parties walk away richer. Now, Community 2 is sitting on 50 obsidian cores. They do not need all 50. They keep 30 cores for their own craftsmen. But they take the remaining 20 cores, and the following month, their young men walk 30 miles south to the territory of Community 3. Community 3 has no sheep, but they have access to a rare deposit of red ochre, a vibrant mineral pigment used in religious rituals and body painting. Community 2 trades 20 obsidian cores to Community 3 in exchange for leather bags of red ochre. Community 3 keeps 15 cores and trades the remaining 5 cores to Community 4 for woven hemp ropes and timber. Do you see what is happening? The obsidian is traveling like a wave through a medium. It is moving from hand to hand, valley to valley, tribe to tribe. The people of Community 1 have never seen the red ochre of Community 3. The people of Community 20 near the Dead Sea have never seen a volcano in their lives. They might not even possess a word in their language for volcano. To them, this black glass is a mythical substance that arrives from the mysterious north, passed down through a chain of trading partners that stretches beyond their comprehension. And look at what happens to the value of that stone as it travels down the line. At Community 1, near the volcano, obsidian is cheap. It is everywhere. You would trade an entire 5-pound core for a handful of wild nuts. By the time that stone reaches Community 20, 400 miles to the south, 99% of the original volume has been peeled off by the intermediate tribes along the way. That single remaining core is now worth an absolute fortune. A craftsman in Jericho will not use it to chop wood. He will treat it like diamond. He will carefully, painstakingly press off microscopic prismatic blades just a millimeter wide, using every single grain of the material until nothing is left but an exhausted bullet core, the size of a thumb, which is then drilled with a hole and worn around a chieftain's neck as a sacred jewel. This was the birth of scarcity-driven value. Consider the profound neurological and cognitive revolution that trade demanded from the human brain. In evolutionary psychology, the capacity for reciprocal altruism is one of the rarest behavioral adaptations in the animal kingdom. Most animals only share resources with their direct genetic offspring or immediate kin. When a Neolithic hunter stood before a stranger from a foreign tribe and handed over a 5-pound core of obsidian in exchange for 30 dried sheepskins, his brain was performing an extraordinary sequence of abstract cognitive operations. First, he had to suppress the primal amygdala-driven fear and aggression response that screams to kill the stranger. Second, he had to perform a complex economic valuation, calculating the labor time invested in quarrying and transporting the stone against the calories and warmth represented by the sheepskins. Third, he had to project into the future, visualizing how those sheepskins would keep his family warm next winter, and trusting that the stranger would not ambush him on the return trail. Fourth, he had to establish a mental ledger of reputational fairness, knowing that if the trade was perceived as unfair or deceptive, the entire regional network would sever and future survival would be compromised. Trade was the cognitive crucible that forged modern human morality, justice, and the concept of universal human value. Long before philosophers wrote treatises on ethics, the daily necessity of exchanging obsidian forced our ancestors to discover the golden rule in the dirt of Anatolia. Treat the stranger with fairness, because your own survival depends upon the stone in his hand. This was the birth of the supply chain. To understand the profound archaeological evidence of this down-the-line network, one must look at the deepest stratigraphic trenches of the ancient oasis city of Jericho in the lower Jordan Valley. Jericho is one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on Earth. In the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B layers, British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated a monumental stone defensive wall backed by a colossal, circular stone watchtower standing over 26 feet high, with an internal 22-step staircase carved from solid limestone blocks. Inside the plastered domestic mud brick houses surrounding this monumental tower, Kenyon made one of the most haunting discoveries in world archaeology. The Jericho skulls. Ancient inhabitants of Jericho had carefully exhumed the skulls of their deceased ancestors, separated them from the skeletons, and modeled their facial features in lifelike detail using fine gypsum plaster. The plaster was painted to mimic living human skin and inlaid into the empty eye sockets of the ancestral skulls to represent living, seeing human eyes were two distinct materials. In some skulls, they used polished bivalve marine shells imported from the Mediterranean coast 50 miles to the west. And in the most prominent, elite ancestral skulls, they inlaid razor-sharp, translucent flakes of jet-black obsidian imported from the volcanic peaks of Cappadocia, 450 miles to the north. Gazing into the obsidian eyes of a 9,000-year-old plastered skull from Jericho is a transcendent experience. It proves that obsidian was not merely an economic utility for skinning animals. It was imbued with supreme cosmological and religious power. The black volcanic glass was chosen to give eternal vision to the dead, connecting the living community of the Jordan Valley to the sacred, mysterious volcanic mountains of the north. Think about the profound psychological and social requirements necessary to sustain a chain like this. A down-the-line trade network cannot exist in a state of perpetual, chaotic warfare. If Community 4 ambushes, robs, and murders the traders from Community 3, the entire chain breaks. The flow of obsidian stops. Community 5 doesn't get its stone. Community 3 doesn't get its timber. Community 4 becomes an isolated target of retribution. To keep the stones moving, humanity had to invent something completely unprecedented in evolutionary history. Institutionalized trust between strangers. How do you build trust with a group of people who do not belong to your kin group? People whose grandfather your grandfather might have killed in a skirmish 30 years ago? You build it through ritual. You build it through ceremony. Archaeological digs across the ancient Near East reveal that the earliest trade meetings were not sterile, commercial transactions. They were elaborate, high-stakes diplomatic theater. When two bands met along the Obsidian Trail, they did not simply swap rocks and walk away. They engaged in formal gift-giving ceremonies. They sat down and shared ceremonial feasts, feasts that required immense advanced preparation, hunting surplus game, and brewing the earliest wild fermented beverages. They smoked herbs. They danced. They invoked common ancestral spirits or celestial deities to act as supernatural guarantors of the peace. To break a trade truce was not just an economic offense. It was a religious sacrilege that would bring down the wrath of the heavens. And to cement the economic alliance across generations, they did something even more permanent. They traded their children. Intermarriage was the ultimate glue of the ancient networks. A headman from Community 2 would give his daughter in marriage, to the son of the headman of Community 3. Now, the trade route was no longer between strangers. It was between family. When you walked down the trail with a basket of obsidian, you were walking to the village of your sister, your cousins, your in-laws. Violence was suppressed by the bonds of blood. Without realizing it, the search for sharp volcanic glass was rewiring the social architecture of the human species. It was forcing isolated, xenophobic bands of hunter-gatherers to stitch themselves together into larger, regional confederacies. It was creating the proto-languages, the diplomatic customs, and the peace treaties that would eventually form the foundations of the First Nations. If you want to see the physical proof of how trade transformed human society at the end of the Ice Age, you only have to look at the most shocking archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Göbekli Tepe. Located in southeastern Turkey, perched on a barren limestone ridge overlooking the Harran Plain, Göbekli Tepe dates back to roughly 9,500 BCE, nearly 12,000 years ago. It is 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. It is older than the invention of pottery, older than metal tools, older than domesticated wheat, and older than the city of Babylon. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating the site in the mid-1990s, what he found defied every conventional theory of human history. Carved out of the bedrock were dozens of massive, circular stone sanctuaries. Looming inside these circles were colossal, T-shaped limestone megaliths standing up to 18 feet high and weighing up to 20 tons each. Carved across their surfaces in high relief were masterfully executed, terrifying depictions of wild animals, charging boars, roaring lions, lethal scorpions, vultures hovering over headless human bodies, and giant venomous snakes. For decades, the standard textbook theory of human evolution taught that first, humans invented agriculture. Agriculture created a food surplus. The food surplus allowed humans to settle down in permanent villages. Villages grew into cities, and only then, with thousands of organized laborers, did humans have the time and resources to build monumental religious architecture. Göbekli Tepe completely shattered that timeline. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not farmers. They had no domesticated crops. They had no domesticated animals except the dog. They were hunter-gatherers. How did nomadic hunter-gatherers, wandering the hills in small bands of 30 people, quarry 20-ton stone pillars, drag them hundreds of yards across the plateau, carve them with exquisite artistic mastery, and erect them into complex astronomical alignments? It required hundreds, perhaps thousands, of humans working together in coordinated labor for months at a time. How do you feed 1,000 hunter-gatherers in one spot for 3 months? How do you keep 20 rival tribes from slaughtering each other on the hillside? The answer, once again, is found in the dirt beneath the megaliths. When archaeologists analyzed the stone tool assemblages recovered from Göbekli Tepe, they found thousands upon thousands of obsidian blades and debitage flakes. And when they shot those blades with X-ray fluorescent spectrometry, they discovered something breathtaking. The obsidian at Göbekli Tepe did not come from one local source. It came from all of them. There was obsidian from Bengal, over 100 miles to the northeast. There was obsidian from Nemrud Dag, near Lake Van, nearly 200 miles away. And there was obsidian from Gala Dag and Ninazi Dag in Cappadocia, over 250 miles to the west across the Euphrates River. Göbekli Tepe was not just a temple. Göbekli Tepe was a colossal, seasonal continental trade hub. Picture the scene 12,000 years ago. Every autumn, as the scorching heat of the summer broke, bands of hunter-gatherers from hundreds of miles in every direction began their pilgrimage to this sacred ridge. They converged on Göbekli Tepe. They brought with them the surplus commodities of their home territories: dried gazelle meat from the Syrian plains, cedar oil from the Mediterranean coast, red ochre from the mountains, and, above all, tons of raw obsidian from the Anatolian volcanoes. Here, under the watchful eyes of the stone megaliths and the terrifying totemic animals carved into the rock, they held massive religious festivals. They sacrificed animals. They feasted on wild grain and wild game. And in this sacred, neutral space, guaranteed by the presence of the gods, they conducted the grand exchanges of the year. They traded obsidian. They traded stories. They arranged marriages. They initiated their youth into secret ritual societies. Trade and religion were not separate spheres of life. They were two sides of the exact same coin. The temple existed to sanctify the market. The market provided the wealth and labor to build the temple. And as these trade networks deepened, something even more transformative began to happen just a few hundred miles to the west, in the heart of the Cappadocian Obsidian Zone. Around 7100 BC, on the Konya plain of central Turkey, a settlement was founded that would become one of the largest and most famous proto-cities in the world. Catalhook. Catalhook was a sprawling Neolithic metropolis of up to 8,000 people. It had no streets. The mud brick houses were built directly against one another like a giant honeycomb. People walked across the flat rooftops and entered their homes through wooden ladders lowered down through holes in the ceilings. Inside those plaster-walled rooms, archaeologists found murals of exploding volcanoes, specifically a twin-peaked volcano that many believe is a direct painting of Mount Hassan erupting in the distance. And buried beneath the floors of those houses, tucked into corners like secret treasure hoards, were massive deposits of obsidian, thousands of finished spear points, scrapers, mirrors polished to a reflective perfection so flawless you could see the pores on your face, and gigantic unworked cores. Catalhook was not just an agricultural village. Catalhook was the first great boomtown in human history. It was the Silicon Valley of the Neolithic. Its wealth, its size, and its cultural power were built directly on top of its total monopoly over the Cappadocian obsidian trade. They controlled the quarries of Galadag and Mount Hassan. They were the master knappers who processed the raw glass into standardized, high-value blades and traded them across the entire Near Eastern world. In exchange for their black glass, the people of Catalhook received luxury goods from thousands of miles away: marine shells from the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, turquoise from the Sinai Peninsula, lapis lazuli from Central Asia, and rare timbers from distant mountains. Look at what has happened in the span of just a few thousand years. We started with isolated, terrified hunter-gatherers huddled around a campfire, afraid to look past the ridge of their valley. Now, driven by the insatiable hunger for an exceptional stone, humanity has built continental relay networks, monumental stone sanctuaries like Göbekli Tepe, and thriving proto-cities like Catalhook. At Göbekli Tepe, the sheer scale of social coordination required to build and maintain the monumental enclosures demands a complete reevaluation of Stone Age economics. Excavations led by the German Archaeological Institute revealed that the construction of enclosures A, B, C, and D occurred in a landscape that was rich in wild resources, vast herds of migrating Persian gazelles, wild cattle, wild boars, and expansive fields of wild einkorn and emmer wheat. To feed the hundreds of builders gathered at the sanctuary, immense communal feasts were organized. Archaeologists recovered over 100,000 broken animal bones from the backfill of the enclosures, with gazelle and cattle bones showing unmistakable butchery cut marks made by razor-sharp obsidian blades. Furthermore, excavators discovered massive, limestone-carved stone troughs and vats with capacities of up to 160 liters. Biochemical residue analysis of the interior surfaces of these stone vessels revealed traces of calcium oxalate, proving that 12,000 years ago, the builders of Göbekli Tepe were brewing colossal quantities of wild fermented barley beer to fuel their monumental building projects and religious festivals. And at Catalhoek, excavated by James Mellart in the 1960s and later by Ian Hodder, the obsidian economy created an unprecedented domestic lifestyle. In Shrine 14 of Catalhoek, painted across the north and east walls of a mud brick room, Mellart discovered a 10-foot-long fresco dating to approximately 6,600 BC. The Volcano Mural. In the foreground of the painting is a detailed, bird's-eye town plan of Catalhoek, showing dozens of rectangular, flat-roofed houses clustered tightly together like a honeycomb. Looming directly in the background is a massive, two-peaked mountain erupting violently into the sky, black smoke, red lava bombs, and glowing volcanic ash exploding from the summits. Geological and volcanological fieldwork conducted by French and Turkish geoscientists confirmed that Mount Hassan, located just 70 miles northeast of Catalhoek, underwent a major explosive eruption around 6,900 BC, matching the radiocarbon date of the mural within statistical error. The people of Catalhoek were the first human beings in history to paint an eyewitness portrait of a volcanic eruption. They painted the mountain because the mountain was the sacred mother of their wealth. The volcano was the divine forge that gifted them the black glass that made their city the commercial wonder of the Neolithic world. And Anatolia was not the only theater where obsidian cracked open the ancient world. In the western and central Mediterranean, obsidian drove an even more daring technological revolution. The dawn of seafaring. In the Franchi cave, perched on the Peloponnese peninsula of Greece, archaeologists excavating stratigraphic layers dating to 11,000 BC discovered hundreds of obsidian blades and flakes. When X-ray fluorescent spectrometry was applied to the Franchi obsidian, the chemical fingerprint revealed that the stone did not come from mainland Greece. It came from the volcanic island of Melos, an island situated 80 miles out in the open, dangerous waters of the Aegean Sea. Think about the staggering implications of that discovery. In 11,000 BC, thousands of years before the invention of the sail, Mesolithic humans were building seaworthy paddle boats, loading their crews with obsidian cores, and navigating across 80 miles of open, stormy sea to harvest volcanic glass from an uninhabited island. In the central Mediterranean, The same maritime drama unfolded around the volcanic island of Lipari off the coast of Sicily and Monte Arsi on Sardinia. Neolithic mariners built skin kayaks and dugout canoes to transport Sardinian obsidian across the Tyrrhenian Sea to the coast of Corsica, northern Italy, and southern France. Obsidian was not merely a land commodity. Obsidian forced humanity to conquer the sea thousands of years before the first wooden ships of the Bronze Age. And look at what happened at the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, at the prehistoric site of Kaonu Tepesi in southeastern Turkey, dating to roughly 8,200 BCE. At Kaonu, archaeologists excavating alongside thousands of obsidian blades discovered the earliest known metal artifacts in the history of human civilization. Small, cold-hammered pins, hooks, and beads made from native copper nuggets found in the nearby Ergani Maiden copper deposits. The people of Kaonu did not discover copper because they set out to invent metallurgy. They discovered copper because for 2,000 years, their hunters and prospectors had been scouring the mountain stream beds and rocky outcrops of the Taurus Range in search of obsidian. As their eyes searched the ground for glassy black nodules, they noticed heavy, malleable green and reddish stones that did not shatter when struck with a hammerstone. They applied their stone knapping and polishing skills to this strange new stone, discovering that it could be hammered, annealed in campfires, and bent into new shapes without breaking. The obsidian trails were the physical cradle that birthed the age of metals. Without the thousands of years of geological prospecting, trailblazing, and long-distance trade pioneered by the obsidian hunters, humanity would never have stumbled upon the copper, the tin, and the iron that built the modern world. The invisible web was expanding. When an economist looks at a trade route, they see the movement of physical goods. They see tonnage, units, price elasticity, and supply and demand curves. They track the obsidian moving south, and the shells, hides, and grain moving north. But an anthropologist or a historian knows a deeper truth. The most important cargo on any trade route is never the physical commodity. The physical commodity is merely the carrier wave. The physical commodity is the excuse. The real cargo, the transformative payload of trade, is the invisible information that travels along with the goods. When a trader from Cappadocia met a trader from the Levant, they did not just exchange volcanic glass for sheepskins in robotic silence. They had to communicate. At first, communication was crude, hand gestures, pointing, mimicking animal sounds, drawing symbols in the dirt with a stick. But as generations passed, and the same trading families met at the same river crossings year after year, something magical began to emerge. A shared vocabulary. They invented the world's first pidgins, simplified contact languages. Words for numbers, 1, 2, 3 many. Words for commodities, stone, sharp, meat, skin, fire, moon. Words for social relations, friend, peace, brother, chief. These proto-languages of commerce began to bridge the linguistic isolation of early humanity. They allowed complex ideas to leap across cultural boundaries that had previously been impenetrable walls of incomprehension. And what ideas were leaping across those obsidian trails? First, technology. Imagine you are a hunter in the Levant. You have spent your entire life napping stone using direct percussion, smashing one rock against another with a brute force swing of your arm. It produces thick, clunky, wasteful flakes. Half the stone is ruined in the process. Now, you sit around a campfire with an obsidian trader from Anatolia. You watch him work. He does not swing a rock. He places the point of a polished deer antler against the edge of an obsidian core. He braces the core against his chest with a leather chest pad. And with a smooth, controlled lean of his upper body, he applies steady, continuous mechanical pressure. Snap. A perfectly symmetrical, razor-thin blade, 4 inches long, drops into his lap with the ease of peeling an apple. You have just witnessed pressure napping, a revolutionary manufacturing technique that maximizes the yield of sharp cutting edge per pound of raw stone by a factor of 10. The next morning, you take an antler billet and you try it on your local flint. It works. You teach it to your son. Your son teaches it to his cousins. Within 50 years, the pressure napping technique has spread across the entire Middle East, carried along the exact same trails that carried the obsidian. Second, agriculture and botanical knowledge. For millennia, humans in the Fertile Crescent had been gathering wild grasses, wild emmer, wild einkorn wheat, wild barley, lentils, and chickpeas. When traders traveled hundreds of miles along the obsidian trails, they did not just carry stone, they carried trail food. They carried leather pouches filled with roasted wild grains and dried legumes. Seeds dropped near trading camps. Traders observed that in certain valleys, wild wheat grew with larger grains or had husks that did not shatter in the wind. They took those seeds home as curiosities or gifts. They planted them near their permanent seasonal shelters. The ideas of plant cultivation, animal domestication, and storage technology traveled down the exact same pathways that had been blazed by the obsidian hunters thousands of years earlier. Third, and perhaps most profound, mythology, religion, and art. When ancient people gathered around the trading fires at Göbekli Tepe or along the banks of the Euphrates, they did what all humans do in the dark. They told stories. They shared their creation myths. They shared their explanations for why the sun rises in the east, why the stars rotate across the night sky, why earthquakes shake the earth, and what happens to the human soul when the breath leaves the body. If you study the comparative mythology of the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean, and the Indo-European world, you find eerie, unmistakable structural parallels. The myth of the dying and resurrecting God. The myth of the great primordial flood that wiped out ancient humanity. The myth of the hero who descends into the underworld to retrieve a lost love or steal the fire of the gods. The sacred symbolism of the bull, the serpent, and the mother goddess. These myths did not evolve in complete, sterile isolation in 20 different valleys. They were cross-pollinated. They were mixed, blended, and hybridized along the trading trails. A myth born in the mountains of Armenia was carried down the Euphrates to Sumer, where it was incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh. A religious icon carved into an obsidian pendant in Anatolia inspired a stone idol carved in a village on the coast of the Mediterranean. The obsidian trails were the prehistoric internet. The obsidian cores were the hardware. The trade routes were the fiber optic cables. And the languages, technologies, and mythologies were the software, the data packets racing across the landscape, slowly constructing the collective consciousness of human civilization. Take a step back and look at the colossal arc of the story we have just traced. 12,000 years ago, our ancestors were trapped in tiny, fragmented, terrified islands of humanity. We were prisoners of our geography. We were prisoners of our evolutionary suspicion. If humanity had remained satisfied with what was immediately available in our own native valleys, if we had accepted the blunt flint and the dull limestone of our backyards, the human story might have stalled. We might have remained eternal hunter-gatherers, wandering the forests in isolated bands, leaving behind nothing but scattered campfire ash and broken bones. But we were not satisfied. We looked across the horizon. We saw the impossible black glass of the distant volcanoes. And driven by an unquenchable human desire for something better, something sharper, something more beautiful, we took the first step into the dark. We walked across the mountains. We risked our lives to cross the territories of strangers. We learned to suppress our violent instincts in favor of economic exchange. We built trust through ritual, feasting, and marriage. We constructed monumental gathering places like Göbekli Tepe to sanctify our commerce. And we built the world's first boomtowns like Catalhook on the profits of our trade. The Obsidian trails prove something fundamental about human nature. We are, at our core, a connecting species. Trade was not an accidental byproduct of civilization. Trade was the engine that created civilization. Trade was the spark that ignited the entire human experiment. By 4000 BC, the Stone Age was drawing to a close. The Obsidian trails had done their work. They had mapped the land. They had connected Anatolia to the Levant to Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia to the Persian Gulf. They had created the roads, the treaties, and the urban centers. But humanity was about to hit a hard, physical ceiling. As villages expanded into true, monumental city-states, cities like Uruk, Uar, and Eridu in the alluvial plains of southern Iraq, the scale of human ambition exploded exponentially. Kings and high priests no longer just wanted small, delicate blades of volcanic glass to skin gazelles. They wanted to build ziggurats that reached into the clouds. They wanted thousands of tons of cedar timber from the mountains of Lebanon. They wanted tens of thousands of pounds of copper to forge weapons and armor for massive standing armies. And here was the brutal mathematical reality. You cannot put a 20-foot cedar log on a man's back. You cannot carry 5 tons of raw copper ingots across 400 miles of desert using leather backpacks and human feet. The overland trails of the Stone Age, for all their glory, were bottlenecked by the physical limits of the human spine and the friction of the dirt. If humanity was going to take the next step, if we were going to build the colossal, interconnected world of the Bronze Age, we had to abandon the safety of the dry land. We had to look away from the mountain trails. And we had to look toward the terrifying, unpredictable, bottomless expanse of the open ocean. Next time, on Season 1 of the Grand Narrative, we leave the stone trails behind and journey to the blistering shores of the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. We will enter the bustling, grid-planned metropolises of the mysterious Indus Valley civilization. We will uncover the forgotten copper empire of Magan in the mountains of Oman. And we will board the terrifying, bitumen-coated wooden vessels that dared to cross hundreds of miles of open water without a compass, carrying the heavy lifeblood of the ancient world. Join us for Episode 2, The Ships of Magan. I am your host. Thank you for listening to the Grand Narrative. When we hold that modern smartphone in our hands today, with its touch screen made of chemically tempered aluminosilicate glass, we are holding the direct technological descendant of the volcanic glass of Cappadocia. The human urge to hold a smooth, dark piece of glass that connects us to distant mines across mountains and oceans did not begin in Silicon Valley in the 21st century. It began 12,000 years ago on the windswept volcanic slopes of Anatolia, when a stone napper looked at a nodule of black volcanic glass and dared to dream of a world beyond the horizon.